Hello, this is Michael George of Sagesse Healthcare Consulting, and this is a new edition of the Pioneering Patient Podcast. Now, in this podcast, we won't be offering medical advice. We advise you to go to your doctor for that, but we will be offering you informative, thought-provoking, and inspiring patient stories. My guest today is someone who had a heart attack just 5 days after giving birth. She went to hospital and was diagnosed with anything other than a heart attack. Fortunately, she kept going, she advocated for herself, and she got the treatment she needed. 20 years on, she's still battling and advocating on behalf of other patients. So, Rhonda Monroe, welcome to the Pioneering Patient Podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And let's go back 20 years to the time when you were 36. You were doing very well in your life. You're pregnant with your third child. Everything looked to be perfect, but then things changed very suddenly during coming towards the end of that pregnancy. Tell us more about that story.
Well, during my pregnancy, I was tired. I was extremely tired, and I mentioned it to my obstetrician, who said, "Oh, girl, you're just getting old." Obviously, I was not very old. And then 5 days after I gave birth, I suffered a massive heart attack. And for a moment, I thought, no, I can't be having a heart attack. I'm too young. And then my symptoms persisted, and I said, I'm looking in the mirror at myself, and I said, I'm having a heart attack. So I called the ambulance and was taken to hospital by ambulance, and they did an EKG and gave me aspirin and morphine, their standard protocol. And when I got to the hospital, I never made it back to the cardiac care area of the hospital, not once. During that, for an entire week, I was observed and discharged. I was given some of the most ridiculous diagnoses. I had indigestion, a slip disc, and finally, at the end of the week, called a hysterical new mother, despite the fact that I wasn't a new mother. It was my third child. And the clinical notes that I later retrieved referred to me as stoic.
So why do you think you were given these diagnoses?
Women are often discounted. Much of clinical research is done on middle-aged white men. And so I didn't look like what research said was a typical heart attack patient. So despite my classic symptoms, elephant on the chest, nausea, vomiting, sweating, numbness and tingling in my left arm. In spite of that, and the empirical evidence of an EKG confirmed heart attack, acute myocardial infarction, in spite of that, because I didn't look like a typical heart patient, I was misdiagnosed.
And you, I think, returned to the hospital after 7 days. And what kind of welcome were you given when you returned there?
Well, I went several times during that week. One time in the middle of the week, they said, I asked for the doctor to come back in. He refused to come back in. And then the nurse said, well, can you wheel her by the payment office? Absolutely ridiculous. We could see where your priorities are. But when I went in that 7th day, I couldn't even walk on my own. Could not walk on my own. So a neighbor brought me to the hospital and she wheeled me in, and the receptionist who had been there earlier in the week looked at me and said, "Oh, you again?" And then told my neighbor to wheel me out of the way. A few minutes later, a white woman walked in and said, "I think I'm having an allergic reaction," and she was taken immediately back. And so I asked my neighbor to wheel me back up there. And I said, I was here before her. Why was I not taken back? Oh, well, she says she thinks she's having an allergic reaction, and so that could be life-threatening. And a heart attack is not? 2 hours later, I was finally seen, taken back, and the nurse who triaged me said, well, based on what you're telling me, I'm going to take you back to the cardiac care area. Wait, what? There's a cardiac care area here in the ER? I had never made it back there the entire week. So I was taken back to the cardiac care area. They ran additional tests, and the same doctor who refused to come and see me in the middle of the week came back and said, young lady, I'm glad you were persistent. You're right. You are having a heart attack, and now we've got to transfer you downtown to save your life.
So what happened then? You had to go through what procedure then?
I went to the cath lab.
Yeah.
And at that point, they thought they were going to do a simple procedure, but quickly realized that was not going to be possible because I had dissections in 5 coronary arteries, my left main, LAD, circumflex, right coronary, and a diagonal. So off to the OR I go, and I underwent an emergency quadruple bypass.
That's pretty significant in itself, but it was just the start of what was a nightmare year for you, wasn't it? It's back and forth to the hospital.
It was the beginning, right? And initially I thought it would be the beginning and the end, but it was literally just the beginning of, quite frankly, a 20-year journey now. And so after that, 2 weeks later, I ended up back in the hospital. I had Dressler syndrome and then recurrent pericarditis for the entire year following that. But 3 months post-surgery, I developed arrhythmias, and I said to the doctors, something's still wrong. I was dismissed again. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, I said, well, they're still not listening. Clearly, I need to seek help somewhere else. And so I went back home to Washington, D.C. My cousin recommended a cardiologist. That cardiologist sent me to the EP lab. Indeed, I tested positive for ventricular tachycardia and was fitted with a defibrillator for primary prevention and, well, secondary prevention, because my event was already over. Yeah. And after that, I went through cardiac rehab. And on the last week of cardiac rehab, I noticed that I was having pain. So I called the cardiologist and I said, I'm having chest pain again. It's my last week of cardiac rehab, but something's going on. And she said, well, pack a bag when you come for your appointment. I had an appointment on February 8th. So I packed a bag and I went for my appointment and I went in the cath lab. Well, at this point, I know a little something, right? Because I was misdiagnosed initially, but that's never going to happen to me again. And so I had studied and learned some things about heart disease. So I'm laying on the table and I'm looking at the screen of my catheterization and I'm saying to the doctor, what's that? And what's that? And why does that look like that? Yeah. He's motioning to the anesthesiologist, knock her out. Knock her out. So, and when I wake up, there are 2 people standing in front of me. A nurse who had taken care of me on my 30-day stay when I had the defibrillator implanted because I got an infection. I had some other issues with that. And my EP. Yeah. And so I look at him and I call his full name. I always call his full name. And I'm like, what are you doing here? It's like, they called me in. And I'm like, why? And he has this look on his face. And I said, don't look at me like that. I'm not going to die. Right? And tears began to stream down the nurse's face. I'm telling you, I'm not going to die. I didn't understand what this meant before, but now I have it. I've been waking up every night in the middle of the night, true story. If you believe me for your life, you'll live and not die. And I was writing it down in a notebook in the middle of the night, every night, true story. I had that notebook until the hurricane just wiped me out. Yeah. So I don't have it now, but so every night I was writing this down and right? And I was like, I didn't understand it. I don't know what you mean, because I thought I was in the fight for my life, right? You're about to be in a fight for your life, but if you believe me for your life, you'll live and not die. And I was thinking, well, what was that? Like that was the first card on the first fight on the card. Yeah, you know how on the boxing match that was the first fight on the card. Yeah. Like what is happening here? Anyway, he tells me, all your bypass grafts have shut down. Your ejection fraction is 21%. You have aneurysms all throughout your heart, and your heart is aneurysmal. You have a poor prognosis. Basically, you're not going to live.
Yeah.
I said, that ain't what the Lord told me. I did. That ain't what I didn't get that message, but okay. And so I was like, well, what's the plan? And they're like, there is no plan. Call a family meeting. That's the wrong answer. Yeah. And so they make a PowerPoint presentation. Literally made a PowerPoint presentation of my heart. Arrows, 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 aneurysm, 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 and the vessels that are occluded. And then an arrow to the apex, which is also occluded. And the doctor brings it in my room, and I'm like, and I said, so what are we going to do about this? So he's like, what do you mean, what are we going to do about this? There's nothing we can do. There's something that can be done. When am I going to have surgery? Girl, nobody's operating on you. Like, no one wants to operate on you. You're not going to survive. Your family is going to sue. And it'll be a lawsuit because you're not going to live. Oh, you want to make this a value proposition, do you? I call my friend. I said, bring me some makeup.
Yep.
And something to do my hair and a laptop. And I called a reporter.
Yeah.
Oh, because if this is about money,
yeah,
about losing money, I know what to do.
Because you're an economist as well.
You're going to make, this face will be plastered all over the media, and no one will come here, and you'll lose more money. Yeah. And so I got myself on the front page of the weekend edition of the DC Examiner. And that Monday, the hospital administrator is like, who is this girl in my hospital all over the news? And so, needless to say, the surgeon came back and said, so many people have asked me about you that I'll take another look at you. And if you pass this threshold of tests, we'll operate. Well, it was a fixed fight, right? Yeah, if you believe me, I'll give you your life back. Oh, that's what you meant? Oh, okay. And so it was a gutsy move. Had never done anything like that before, but it just was not in me to give up. That was just not the right answer. I had 3 small children that I was fighting to be alive for. And so them giving up on me was their choice, but I was never going to willingly go without a fight. And my way to fight was with the camera and the...
Brilliant move,
Yes.
move. But you had no choice.
I had no choice. Had they been willing to operate, I wouldn't have done that, but I had to do something to force someone to listen to me. And if it was about a bottom line, I know how to impact a bottom line.
Yeah, exactly.
I studied business in school.
Yeah,
I have an MBA. Right?
Exactly. So you weren't going to give up on your life. You saved your own life in a way.
I
and
did.
You advocated for yourself. And since then, you've been advocating for women and patients throughout the US, haven't you?
I have. I refused to give up and literally said, now I'm directing the conversation. Well, since you've given me my life, and if you let me live, I promise I'm going to raise my voice. Yeah. It's a vow that I made. If I survive this, I'm going to do what I can do so that no one else has to endure what I endured.
And it's a doctor, I think, who treated you, who actually first put you into the advocacy mode.
He did. The same doctor who was there when I woke up from the cath, the bad news cath, said, I came from the University of Michigan, and we had a program there, an annual program, and I'm going to get them to invite you in as a speaker. And he was true to his word. And that fall, I got a call, I believe it was October, and they flew me out to Michigan, and I spoke in front of a crowd of young ICD patients, so patients who had been implanted just like me. And after the session, they lined up, right? And so in giving voice to other people's circumstances, I had found my own voice.
And so then the next step was really, I think, getting involved in Women Heart, because you've been a significant player, a women champion there for a while.
It was. So that was my first step of advocacy. So I would go to this program, and a woman who lines up in the line says, do you know Nancy Loving? She and some other women have started an organization called Women Heart. And I said, I'm not familiar with this. She says, they're in Washington, D.C. I was like, well, that's where I'm from, but I'm not familiar. So she connected us, introduced us, and we met. And then she said, well, you need to decide if you want to work with us or if you're going to do your own thing. And a couple months later, she called and said, I got a message from the Today Show and they wanted to interview someone. Would you be willing to go on the Today Show to represent us? And that really was the beginning of my journey. And then I went through the formal program at Women Heart and became a Women Heart champion, became a legislative advocate, and then was invited to the board of directors and ultimately elected chair of the board, and so did that. And then in 2018, I left the board of Women Heart, and I started with the HFSA, so the Heart Failure Society of America. They were wanting to launch a patient advocacy committee, and so I helped them launch their inaugural patient committee, and then did that for 2 years, and then 2 years later served on their legislative advocacy committee. And when I completed my tenure there, because it's a 2-year term, I went on to be a part of the Heart Failure Collaboratory, and so I serve on the Heart Failure Collaboratory now.
And it's been important. You said you know a bit about medicine now, but you know an awful lot. It's been very important for you to really learn about it, and you're also encouraging other patients to learn about it. But tell me why that's important, what you've done.
It's so important. When I initially was diagnosed and I was speaking to the doctors, it was as if they couldn't hear me. Mm-hmm. They weren't understanding what I was saying. And so I felt the need to learn their language so that they could hear what I was saying. So when I was like an elephant sitting on my chest, that's a common phrase, but when their ears perk up when I say I had crushing substernal chest pain. I dissected this, that, and the other. So I'm speaking their language, and now they feel like, oh, well, let me lean in and listen to what she's saying. And so I felt that it was important for me to learn it, to be able to speak up on behalf of myself, first and foremost, but then also on behalf of others. So, because so many patients don't have a voice, don't feel like they have a voice, and don't have the wherewithal or the courage to stand up and challenge a doctor. I initially said, I'm not a doctor, but I'm educated, I'm articulate, I have 3 degrees, and I'm an expert on Rhonda. I literally know myself. This is abnormal, you know, but being able to say that in a way that they understand it made a lot of difference.
And so it's important to you. You're pushing very much for patients to be engaged at the early stages in clinical trials and regulatory process. That's important. So tell me more about that.
It absolutely is. So I told you about the advocacy organizations I served in, and I also served on the board of directors of 2 hospitals, on the finance committee and then on the quality and safety committee. And I did that because I really wanted to know healthcare in its totality so I could really understand how to move the needle for patients. And so after doing that, learning what pushes the bottom line, what impacts decisions in the system, then I said, where can I have the biggest impact? And what I saw is that there were a lot of people at the grassroots level, a lot of people at the legislative level, a lot of people in healthcare organizations like HFSA, ACC, and all of that, but virtually no patients engaged in research, and not engaged in research design, protocol design, the consent form, the language that is lay language friendly to the patient so they understand it, a pamphlet explaining the benefits and the risks of the study, a one-page summary of the informed consent with graphics, videos talking to specific issues that patients are concerned about with clinical trials. And then where African Americans and women are concerned and Hispanics are concerned, really speaking to the fact that they have been excluded from research and encouraging them to engage in research and why they should engage. Because if these therapies are going to be applied to you, they should be studied on you.
And getting patients, you've got obviously very high level of knowledge, but you want to get patients up to that level where they can also take part in this. So do you see yourself being able to help or others with bringing these patients up, having a course that patients can get up to that level?
I do. So that's one of my goals coming for 2025. One of my goals is really to design a course that will help patients contribute to research in meaningful ways so that they are engaged at the onset, so that they can talk about endpoints that are not just clinically meaningful or relevant to researchers, but also have significance to patients as well. And then can understand how to be part of the creative process to design patient-friendly materials, things that matter to patients. And so I hope to design a course that at least summarize the consent and maybe make some patient-facing materials. I mean, if I can train them to do that, maybe not completely understand a protocol, a research protocol, but it's just the beginning stage to have the patient in different various trials informing the design of the information that will be handed to participants would be key. Because a lot of times it's being created by people who will never be in these studies, who think at a much higher level, who have a higher health literacy, and really don't know what's relevant to the communities that they're trying to communicate with.
And some people might say, well, look, it takes time, it takes money, effort to get the patients involved, but what would you say about the real benefits that come from this patient engagement right from the outset?
You know, doctors always learn something. They don't go in thinking that they're going to learn something, and inevitably they say, oh, I never thought about that, because the patient experience, even though we're all patients, is very different from the clinical side of research. And so having information that you can share with a patient that will increase their likelihood or at least help them make an informed decision is going to be so beneficial into getting these underrepresented groups, women and minorities, into clinical research.
So now if you look at her final question, if the experience you went through was major and traumatic for you. If you look a few years ahead, how do you want the healthcare system to be better for women like you?
Not just for women like me. I want the health system to be better for patients in general. I want researchers who are women, who are leading research, who don't necessarily have to have a co-PI that's a man, simply because the thought is still that women are incapable of leading research, major research studies independently. So I want women leading research. I want women investigators, right? I want minority investigators. I want a research study team that's reflective of the population you're trying to study, and ultimately reflective of the people who will be treated. African Americans, minorities are disproportionately affected. We heard a lot of that at the Unite Summit this year, are disproportionately affected, but yet not reflected in research studies and in research design or in research leadership. And so I really, if I could transform anything, it would be to change the landscape, shift the culture of research so that it's inclusive of women and underrepresented minorities at the trial research level and at the participation level.
Thank you. Rhonda, thank you very much for sharing your amazing story. Thank you very much for advocating so brilliantly for other patients. Thank you for
It's my pleasure to be here, and really grateful, honestly, to be alive. To be alive, and so anything that I can do to raise the patient voice and to move the needle further ahead, I'm happy to do it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of another Pioneering Patient podcast. If you have ideas or guest suggestions for future editions, please send an email to me. I'll put the email at the end of this program. So thank you for joining, and please take care of your health.